The dispersion of the Jewish people from Palestine, the Diaspora, began in the 6th century BC when Babylon conquered the southern Palestinian kingdom of Judah, destroyed Solomon's temple, and carried a large body of Jews into captivity. By the beginning of the Christian era, under Roman hegemony, Jews had established communities in Egypt, in Greece, around the Mediterranean, and on the shores of the Black Sea, and there were Jewish slaves with the Roman legions on the Rhine. Conditions worsened again for the Jews when the empire was Christianized in the 4th century A.D. with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. Christianity and Judaism competed, in a Darwinian sense, for the same holy land and the same holy books. Under systematic persecution, only a small remnant of the Jewish people remained in Judea. The fantasy of Jews as a brotherhood of evil was invented during this era when Christianity fought its missionary way to dominance. In the disorder of the Dark Ages, the Jews lost even their vestigial Roman citizenship. Those who sought protection won it from rulers like Charlemagne's son Louis the Pious, who knew their worth as merchants and craftsmen, but the price of protection was that they became the ruler's property. Their rights were thus no longer inherent but chartered. Against that threatening insecurity, Jews could count their gain of judicial autonomy. Within their communities they were allowed to administer their own laws. In parts of Spain they had the power even of life and death. The medieval church, challenged by the spread of learning and the militancy of Islam to shore up its defenses against heresy, exercised its increasing power over the Jews balefully. The Lateran councils of 1179 and 1215 made the baleful conflict visible by denying Jews authority over Christians, denying them Christian servants, relegating money lending to Jews by forbidding it to Christians, forbidding Christians lodging in Jewish quarters and thus officially sanctioning the establishment of ghettos, and, most onerously, requiring every Jew to wear a distinguishing badge, frequently, on local authority, the yellow Magen David that the Nazis later restored. Every Jew who ventured from the ghetto distinctively marked was a painted bird exposed to attack. The fantasy of Jews as a brotherhood of evil swelled in medieval times to a full-blown demonology. The Jewish Messiah became the Antichrist. The Jews became sorcerers of Satan who poisoned wells, tortured the consecrated host, and murdered Christian children to collect their blood for diabolic rites. When the Black Death struck in the 14th century, a supposedly demonic people who poisoned wells were obvious suspects. They needed only to have infiltrated some more vicious poison into the water supply. A quarter of Europe died of plague, and in that time of horror tens of thousands of Jews were burned, drowned, hanged, or buried alive in retaliation. Massacre became endemic. 350 Jewish communities were decimated in German lands alone. The English were the first to expel the Jews entirely. The Jews of England belonged to the Crown, which had systematically extracted their wealth through a special exchequer to the Jews. By 1290 it had bled them dry. Edward I thereupon confiscated what little they had left and threw them out. They crossed to France, but expulsion from that country followed in 1392, from Spain at the demand of the Inquisition in 1492, from Portugal in 1497. Since Germany was a region of multiple sovereignties, German Jews could not be generally expelled. They had been fleeing eastward from bitter German persecution in any case since the 12th century. The Jews expelled from Western Europe fled to Poland, a large and thinly populated kingdom where elected monarchs welcomed them with generous charters. The medieval German of these emigrant Ashkenazim evolved to Yiddish. They founded villages and towns. They dispersed up and down the long eastern Polish frontier and lived in relative peace for 200 years. 25,000 at the end of the 15th century had increased at least tenfold by the middle of the 17th. Then, in violent wars with Russia and Sweden, Poland began to break up. Cossacks and their peasant allies murdered great numbers of Jews and sacked hundreds of their communities. The Ukraine was split in two. Poland lost the northern half to Russia. War and disorder continued into the 18th century, with Prussia, Austria, and Turkey variously joining the battle. When Russia invaded Poland in 1768, Prussia proposed a three-way partition with Austria to forestall a complete takeover. That led to Poland's partial dismemberment in 1772. In 1795, after another Russian invasion, the country was completely partitioned and ceased to exist. Much truncated, it was revived by the Congress of Vienna in 1814 as Congress Poland, joined to Russia by the linkage of Polish kingship for the Tsar. Its Jewish population had increased by then to more than 1 million souls. Prussia acquired about 150,000 but promptly expelled them eastward. Austria acquired about 250,000. Russia, which soon controlled more than three-fourths of what had been the Polish Commonwealth, then also controlled the fates of most of the Eastern Jews. But while Poland had welcomed them, Russia despised them. Its economy was too primitive to need their commercial skills, and it abhorred their religion. To Catherine the Great, her 1 million new subjects were first and foremost the enemies of Christ. The enemies of Christ became Russia's Jewish problem. In Russia's benighted intolerance, it framed only two solutions: assimilation by conversion to Christianity or expulsion. For the interim, it practiced quarantine. A decree of 1791 limited Jewish residents to the formerly Polish territories and the unpopulated steppes above the Black Sea, a region that extended north across 286,000 square miles of Central Europe to the Baltic. The Pale of Settlement, pale in its old sense of enclosed by a boundary. The Ashkenazim numbered 1/9 of the Pale's total population and might have prospered there, but they were burdened with further restrictions. They were heavily taxed. They could not live in the villages as they had done for generations. They could not keep the village inns or sell liquor to the peasants. Their traditional local governments, the Kahilot, were stripped of legal authority but required to collect Jewish taxes. More horribly, under Nicholas I after 1825, the Kahilot were charged to conscript 12-year-old Jewish children for a lifetime of forced service in the Russian army, 6 years of brutal education followed by 25 years in the ranks, a fate that befell between 40,000 and 50,000 Jewish sons before the requirement was relaxed in 1856. The memory of that cruelty would endure. Edward Teller's grandmother responded to his childhood misbehavior, he reminisced once with a friend, by warning him to be a good boy or the Russians would get him. While Eastern Jews toiled to survive in Mother Russia, emancipation was proceeding in the West. Small Jewish communities had re-established themselves, made up partly of nominal converts to Christianity who had escaped Spain and Portugal for Holland and England and America, partly of Eastern returnees. The Austrian Emperor Joseph II issued an Edict of Tolerance in 1782. The edicts of emperors were less important to the political future of the Jewish people than the temper of the Enlightenment, with its religious skepticism and its faith in the self-evident rights of man. The time had come in the evolution of European forms of government when no single group or class any longer had the power to dominate all others as the nobility had previously done. The nation-state evolved in part to remove this impasse by investing power in the state itself. Such a mechanism made no distinction between Jew and Christian. American Jews thus became American citizens automatically with the Revolution and the Bill of Rights. The French, remembering ghettos and expulsions, found the emancipation of the Jews of France more difficult. The Jews should be denied everything as a nation, the Count of Clermont-Tonnerre argued in the French National Assembly, but granted everything as individuals. It is intolerable that they should become a separate political formation or class in the country. Every one of them must individually become a citizen. When a Jewish community contracted its loyalty to a monarch in exchange for his protection, it only did what other medieval classes and orders had done. But the nation-state was secular, and it considered the autonomous Jewish theocracies lodged within its borders in secular terms. In secular terms, a separate political body, theocratic or not, to which citizens gave their first loyalty was potentially a rival and inherently subversive. Much monstrosity would devolve from that reification. In the meantime, liberty, equality, and fraternity prevailed, and the Jews of France became citoyens on a September Tuesday in 1791. Emancipations as they progressed within less revolutionary states included Holland, Belgium, 1795, Sweden, 1848, Denmark and Greece, 1849, England by a gradual unmuddling completely in 1866, Austria, 1867, Spain by the withdrawal of its 1492 order of expulsion in 1868, the new German Empire, 1871. Though they were influential out of all proportion to their numbers, the emancipated Jews of Western Europe, many of whom moved directly to assimilate, were only a minute fraction of the diaspora. The preponderance of the Jewish people, increased by 1850 to 2.5 million, by 1900 to 5 million, struggled in increasing misery in the Pale. At his coronation in 1856, amid remissions and amnesties, Tsar Alexander II abolished the special conscription of Jewish children. Other alleviations followed, all designed to encourage Jewish assimilation. Useful Jews, wealthy merchants, university graduates, craftsmen, and medical assistants were allowed residence in the interior of Russia beyond the Pale. The universities were restored to autonomy and Jews allowed to attend. Within the Pale, Jews received limited civil rights and became eligible for local councils. But the Tsar, who freed 30 million peasants from serfdom, was dismayed to discover that reform after so many centuries of repression might lead not to expressions of gratitude, but to revolutionary agitation and revolt, as it did in Congress Poland in 1863, and the liberalization of Russian life stalled. Revolutionaries, a splinter group that called itself the People's Will, murdered Alexander on March 13, 1881, by lobbing a hail of small bombs into his open carriage in broad daylight on a main street of St. Petersburg as he drove home from reviewing the Imperial Guards. One member of the People's Will, not a bomber, was Jewish. That was pretext enough in the confused aftermath of regicide to blame the assassination on the Jews. A wave of pogroms, the curious Russian word refers to a violent riot by one group against another, began that continued until 1884. Jewish disorders, the dogmatic new Tsar Alexander III called these murderous raids of drunken mobs on Jewish quarters everywhere in the Pale. They erupted with the active participation or tacit consent of the authorities. More than 200 Jewish communities were attacked. The first wave of pogroms, there would be more in later decades, left 20,000 Jews homeless and 100,000 ruined. Women were raped, families murdered. The government blamed the violence on anarchists and moved to expel even the useful Jews back into the ghettos of the Pale. With the pogroms came the 1882 May Laws, revising or repealing previous reforms and imposing catastrophic new restrictions. Between 1881 and 1900, more than 1 million Jews emigrated from Russia and Central Europe to the United States, and another 1.5 million between 1900 and 1920. A much smaller number of emigrants, like Chaim Weizmann, chose Western Europe and England. Most found less opportunity there than their American counterparts and more virulent anti-Semitism. One of the important sources of German anti-Semitism in the years after the Great War was the strange forgery known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Adolf Hitler took the protocols as a text, to the extent that National Socialism had a text for world domination. "I have read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion," Hitler told one of his loyalists. "It simply appalled me. The stealthiness of the enemy and his ubiquity. I saw at once that we must copy it, in our own way, of course." Heinrich Himmler confirmed that connection. "We owe the art of government to the Jews." To the protocols, he meant, which the Führer learned by heart. The protocols were Russian work. They linked the Jewish experience in Russia with the Jewish experience in Germany, where so few Jews actually lived. Only about 500,000 in 1933, less than 1% of the German population. If Russia's hostility to the Jews was rooted in part in religious conflict, German anti-Semitism, by contrast, needed a secular myth. A half-educated apostate autodidact like Hitler especially needed some structure on which to hang his anti-Semitic pathology. German anti-Semitism had plentiful German antecedents. Richard Wagner's foamings were high on Hitler's list. But the protocols happened to arrive at the right time and place to earn a prominent position well forward. In the 1920s and 1930s, millions of copies of various translations and editions were sold throughout the world. The book is cast in the form of lectures and begins in mid-sentence, its scene unset, as if torn from the evil hands of its perpetrators. To supply the missing background, editors usually bound in explanatory matter. A popular preliminary was a chapter from the novel Biarritz, the work of a minor German postal official, entitled In the Jewish Cemetery in Prague. Editors offered this lurid fiction, like the fiction of the protocols themselves, as fact. The historian Norman Cohn summarizes its setting. At 11 o'clock the gates of the cemetery creak softly, and the rustling of long coats is heard as they touch against the stones and shrubbery. A vague white figure passes like a shadow through the cemetery until it reaches a certain tombstone. Here it kneels down, touches the tombstone 3 times with its forehead, and whispers a prayer. Another figure approaches. It is that of an old man, bent and limping. He coughs and sighs as he moves. The figure takes its place next to its predecessor, and it too kneels down and whispers a prayer. 13 times this procedure is repeated. When the 13th and last figure has taken its place, a clock strikes midnight. From the grave there comes a sharp metallic sound. A blue flame appears and lights up the 13 kneeling figures. A hollow voice, the 13th figure, says, "I greet you, heads of the 12 tribes of Israel." It is the devil speaking, and the figures dutifully reply, "We greet you, son of the accursed." The protocols follow. They are 24 in all, some 80 pages in book form. What I am about to set forth, then, explains the speaker at the beginning of the first protocol, is our system from the 2 points of view, that of ourselves and that of the Goyim. Much about the system set forth is incoherent, but the protocols elaborate 3 main themes: a bitter attack on liberalism, the political methods of the Jewish world conspiracy, and an outline of the world government the elders expect soon to install. The attack on liberalism would be comical if the protocols had not found such vicious use. Liberalism produced constitutional states, and a constitution, as you well know, is nothing else but a school of discords, misunderstandings, quarrels, disagreements, fruitless party agitations, party whims. We replaced the ruler by a caricature of a government, by a president taken from the mob, from the midst of our puppet creatures, our slaves. A touching loyalty to the Russian Ancien Regime surfaces from time to time, and must have given European readers pause. The principal guarantee of stability of rule is to confirm the aureole of power, and this aureole is attained only by such a majestic inflexibility of might as shall carry on its face the emblems of inviolability from mystical causes, from the choice of God. Such was, until recent times, the Russian autocracy, the one and only serious foe we had in the world, without counting the papacy. In brief, the elders have stage-managed the invention and dissemination of modern ideas, of the modern world. Everything more recent than the Russian imperial system of czar, landed nobility, and serfs is part and parcel of their diabolical work, which helps explain how so obscure a study as physics came in Germany in the 1920s to be counted part of the Jewish conspiracy. The elders work to establish a world autocracy ruled by a leader who is a patriarchal, paternal guardian. Liberalism will be rooted out, the masses led away from politics, censorship strict, freedom of the press abolished. A third of the population will be recruited for amateur spying. It will then be no disgrace to be a spy and informer, but a merit. And a vast secret police will keep order. All these were Nazi strategies, and certainly Hitler's debt to the protocols is evident in Mein Kampf and explicitly acknowledged. Russia's contribution to German anti-Semitism was plagiarized from a work of political satire, Dialogues from Hell between Montesquieu and Machiavelli, written by a French lawyer, Maurice Joly, and first published in Brussels in 1864. Montesquieu speaks for liberalism, Machiavelli for despotism. The concoction of the protocols was probably the work of the head of the Tsarist secret police outside Russia, a Paris-based agent named Pyotr Ivanovich Rachkovsky. Borrowing and paraphrasing Machiavelli's speeches without even bothering to change their order and attributing them to a secret Jewish council, Rachkovsky was attempting to discredit Russian liberalism by showing it to be a Jewish plot. A St. Petersburg newspaper serialized the earliest version of the protocols in 1903. It was one of 3 books belonging to the Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna, the other 2 were the Bible and War and Peace, found among her possessions at Yekaterinburg after the murder of the imperial family by communist revolutionaries on July 17, 1918. That coincidence returned the protocols west. Fyodor Winberg, who arranged the German translation and publication of the protocols in Berlin in 1920, was a colonel in the Imperial Guard. The Tsarina had been an honorary colonel of his regiment, and he had worshipped her. He escaped to Germany at the end of the Great War, convinced that her murderers had been Jews. Thereafter, revenge on the Jews was the central fixation of his life. He was a friend to Hitler's advisers, particularly the Nazi Party philosopher, Russian-born Alfred Rosenberg, who published a study of the protocols in 1923. The fiction of a Jewish world conspiracy had practical value for the Nazi Party. As it had done for earlier anti-Semitic parties, writes Hannah Arendt, who was on the scene as a student in Berlin in the 1920s, it gave them the advantage of a domestic program, and conditions were such that one had to enter the arena of social struggle in order to win political power. They could pretend to fight the Jews exactly as the workers were fighting the bourgeoisie. Their advantage was that by attacking the Jews, who were believed to be the secret power behind governments, they could openly attack the state itself. The fiction also served for propaganda to reassure the German people. If the Jews could dominate the world, then so could the Aryans. Arendt continues, thus the protocols presented world conquest as a practical possibility, implied that the whole affair was only a question of inspired or shrewd know-how, and that nobody stood in the way of a German victory over the entire world but a patently small people, the Jews, who ruled it without possessing instruments of violence. An easy opponent, therefore, once their secret was discovered and their method emulated on a larger scale. But the scurrilities of Mein Kampf, which on the evidence of their incoherence are not calculated manipulations but violent emotional outbursts, demonstrate that Hitler pathologically feared and hated the Jews. In black megalomania he masked an intelligent, industrious, and much persecuted people with the distorted features of his own terror. And that would make all the difference. A German journalist had the temerity in 1931 to ask Adolf Hitler where he would find the brains to run the country if he took it over. Hitler snapped that he would be the brains, but went on contemptuously to enlist the help of the German class that still resisted voting the Nazis into power. Do you think perhaps that in the event of a successful revolution along the lines of my party, we would not inherit the brains in droves? Do you believe that the German middle class, this flower of the intelligentsia, would refuse to serve us and place their minds at our disposal? The German middle class would take its stand on the famed ground of the accomplished fact, we will do what we like with the middle class. But what about the Jews? The journalist persisted. Those talented people, war heroes among them, Einstein among them. Everything they have created has been stolen from us, Hitler charged. Everything that they know will be used against us. They should just go and foment their unrest among other peoples. We do not need them. At noon on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler, 43 years old, gleefully accepted appointment as Chancellor of Germany. With the Reichstag fire and the subsequent suspension of constitutional liberties, with the enabling act of March 23rd by which the Reichstag voluntarily gave over its powers to the Hitler cabinet, the Nazis began to consolidate their control. They moved immediately to legalize anti-Semitism and abolish the civil rights of German Jews. Meeting at his country retreat in Berchtesgaden with Joseph Goebbels, now his propaganda minister, Hitler decided on a boycott of Jewish businesses as an opening sally. The national boycott began on Saturday, April 1st. Already during the previous week, Jewish judges and lawyers had been dismissed from practice in Prussia and Bavaria. Now newspapers conveniently published business addresses, and teams of Nazi stormtroopers stationed themselves at storefronts to direct the mobs. Jews caught in the streets were beaten while the police looked on. The boycott was a nationwide German pogrom, and it lasted through a violent weekend. A month earlier, the evening after the Reichstag fire, Wolfgang Pauli had dropped in on a Göttingen group that included Edward Teller. The group had discussed Germany's political situation, and Pauli had declared emphatically that the idea of a German dictatorship was Quatsch, Pauli's favorite dismissal. Rubbish, mush, Nonsense. "I have seen dictatorship in Russia," he told them. "In Germany it just couldn't happen." In Hamburg, Otto Frisch had mustered similar optimism, as indeed had many Germans. "I didn't take Hitler at all seriously at first," Frisch told an interviewer later. "I had the feeling, well, chancellors come and chancellors go, and he will be no worse than the rest of them. Then things began to change." The Third Reich promulgated its first anti-Jewish ordinance on April 7th. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service, the harbinger of some 400 anti-Semitic laws and decrees the Nazis would issue, changed Teller's life, Pauli's, Frisch's, the lives of their colleagues decisively, forever. It announced bluntly that civil servants of non-Aryan descent must retire. A decree defining non-Aryan followed on April 11th. Anyone descended from non-Aryan, especially Jewish, parents or grandparents. Universities were state institutions. Members of their faculties were therefore civil servants. The new law abruptly stripped a quarter of the physicists of Germany, including 11 who had earned or would earn Nobel Prizes, of their positions and their livelihood. It immediately affected some 1,600 scholars in all. Nor were academics dismissed by the Reich likely to find other work. To survive, they would have to emigrate. Some had already left, among them Einstein and the older Hungarians. Einstein read the signs correctly because he was Einstein, and because he had borne the brunt of the attack since immediately after the war. The Hungarians had become connoisseurs by now of advancing fascism.